The solution was tactical rather than technical: fire discipline. Grevich drilled crews in short, brutal bursts, 3 to 5 seconds, maximizing shock while allowing cooling. Ammunition consumption became another logistical headache. A single 100-round box vanished in a heartbeat under storm bursts. Planning resupply and ammunition discipline became as important as the weapons construction. Testing moved quickly from firing line to field exercise. The Stinger's voice was unlike any other, a continuous ripping roar that altered the psychology of the battlefield. Where Japanese defenders had learned to time their movements between the Browning's pauses, they faced an unbroken barrage that left no safe window. The weapon's suppressive power was evident in drills. Firing ports fell silent, heads disappeared, and assault teams found the seconds they needed to close and destroy emplacements. But building the Stinger also required institutional courage from commanders willing to accept unofficial solutions. The paramarine ethos, where improvisation was a survival trait, had diffused through units like the 28th Marines. Battalion leaders who understood the stakes signed off quietly, creating a protective paper trail that kept innovators out of court-martial folders and in the fight. The result was 6 Stingers built in secret workshops, each a testament to field engineering and the thin line between rule and necessity. By the time the invasion fleet steamed for Iwo Jima, the Stinger existed not as theory, but as an instrument destined to be tested in the crucible. Its designers knew its limits and trained its crews. They accepted risks: barrel failure, ammunition shortages, the possibility of punishment for unauthorized modification, because the alternative was watching comrades die while waiting for adequate suppression. The Stinger's creation was not merely mechanical, it was moral. An answer forged from urgency, ingenuity, and the conviction that in war, saving lives sometimes requires breaking the rules. Training, trust, and the test of fire. With 6 prototypes completed, Grevich and his small team faced the harder task, turning field-made machines into reliable instruments of war. There was no manual, no ordnance engineer to sign off, only urgency and improvisation. Training moved out of the shed and onto firing lines where men learned not just to shoot, but to operate within the weapon's narrow margins. Instruction began with anatomy and handling. The Stinger combined aircraft cyclic rates with improvised rifle ergonomics. The recoil cadence, the sight picture mounted on a bar sight, and the altered balance demanded deliberate retraining. Instructors emphasized short, controlled bursts, 3 to 5 seconds, and taught gunners how to judge barrel temperature by feel and rhythm, rather than by gauges that didn't exist. Dry fire drills, progressive live fire sequences at ranges typical of island combat, and repetitive shoulder position practice conditioned men to the weapon's violent personality. Ammunition doctrine required wholesale rethinking. A 100-round box emptied in seconds. Supply discipline became life or death. Platoon logistics rehearsed ammunition runs, pair teams for immediate box swaps were assigned to each gunner, and squad leaders practiced emergency transfer drills under smoke and simulated shrapnel. Grevich insisted on repetitive reload drills with man-down scenarios. Speed and composure during the swap were trainable, and the men drilled until mechanical efficiency became instinct. Tactics evolved to exploit strengths while mitigating weaknesses. The Stinger's volume of fire made it ideal for brief, devastating suppression to cover demolitions teams, and for overwhelming firing ports that normally resisted Browning bursts. Instead of fixed sectors, Stinger teams trained for maneuver, dash into a firing position, deliver a calibrated burst, then shift to deny counterfire. Leaders paired Stinger crews with demolition sections. The machine would pin defenders while engineers closed to destroy emplacements. Platoons practiced bound and cover movements that emphasized mobility over static emplacement, so that the gun's lighter profile could be leveraged in the volcanic terrain. Command endorsed the program cautiously. Battalion authorization provided legal cover while intentionally keeping the weapons off formal inventories. That gray area approval reflected a wartime calculus: risk bureaucratic rebuke or save men's lives. The memo signed by the battalion commander was short and pragmatic. Accept responsibility if the modification failed. Permit use if it saved lives. That compact of trust turned a private innovation into a company asset and bound small unit commanders to the moral risk of field improvisation. Field exercises proved the Stinger's psychological potency. In live trials against experienced role-players, defenders hesitated under sustained Stinger bursts. Heads ducked, shuttered firing ports went silent, and movement stopped. Company commanders who had been skeptical converted after watching suppression unfold in visceral terms that no paper study could replicate. Observers noted that the weapon's effect was as much behavioral as ballistic. Continuous high-volume fire reshaped enemy behavior, creating windows for maneuver and demolition that did not previously exist. Yet limits persisted. Barrels overheated without slipstream cooling, and prolonged firing could ruin a gun in the field. Supply chains strained under prodigious ammunition use. Planners had to stage belt dumps and preposition reserves near expected axes of advance. The men learned strict fire discipline, short controlled bursts, immediate relocation when a position became vulnerable, meticulous maintenance after every action. Medical contingencies were planned. Casualty teams rehearsed extraction of gunners, whose burns or wounds left them incapacitated. By embarkation, the program had matured. 6 guns, trained crews, ammunition plans, casualty contingencies, and a set of informal doctrines were in place. The Stinger was not a polished system, but a force multiplier born of necessity, trust, and repetition. More than metal and welds, it required trained hands and a command willing to accept the moral risk of improvisation. Those elements, workmanship, doctrine, and courage, would shape the weapon's role on Iwo Jima, where discipline and audacity intersembled under fire, and men who trained with the Stinger would decide the instrument's worth. The days before embarkation were a blur of inspections, briefings, and the hushed practical conversations that happen when men prepare to gamble their lives for a single objective. At Camp Pendleton, and later in Hawaii, the 5th Marine Division practiced landings until the maneuvers became muscle memory. Commanders hammered coordination between infantry, engineers, artillery, and naval gunfire into units that would have to synchronize chaos on a foreign shore. Milan Grevich moved among his men with the quiet focus of a craftsman finalizing a tool. The Stingers he and his partners had built were crated, tested, and assigned to sections with detailed instructions about burst discipline, barrel cooling, and ammunition management. Officers and NCOs debated the morality and legality of unsanctioned weapons, even as they acknowledged their pragmatic value. These conversions existed in a grey zone of necessity, tacitly approved by battalion leadership because the potential to save lives outweighed bureaucratic orthodoxy. Intelligence briefings painted a stark image of Iwo Jima, an island ringed by black volcanic sand, dominated by Mount Suribachi, hollowed by tunnels and reinforced concrete, and defended by a Japanese force under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who had converted the island into a subterranean fortress. The maps showed beaches and approach vectors. Photographs revealed gun emplacements, but the underground networks were invisible until men walked onto the island and felt the weight of prepared ambushes. Within platoons, talk turned to routines for ammunition resupply if Stingers burned through belts faster than expected, to signals for calling demolition teams forward, and to the grim calculus of sacrificing concealment for the seconds of suppression that would let a satchel charge or flamethrower team close with a pillbox. Medical orderlies rehearsed triage under ash and smoke. Corpsmen practiced amputation and hemorrhage control with the casual grimness of those who know what their tools may be called upon to do. Naval gunfire coordinators argued for more days of preparatory bombardment. Fleet admirals negotiated resources and risk, balancing the desire to neutralize defenses against operational constraints and the strategic timetable of the Pacific campaign. Meanwhile, the men who would carry the Stingers across ash and rock ran live drills, learning to shoulder the heavy, awkward assemblage that combined aircraft hardware and rifle furniture into a portable engine of suppression. Training emphasized short, controlled bursts and immediate shifts of position to avoid overheating barrels and to complicate enemy targeting. Crews paired gunners with ammunition runners, rehearsing the timbered sprint from supply dumps to forward positions that would later become familiar choreography on the black beaches. Commanders recognized that ingenuity alone would not save lives. Logistics had to match invention. So supply officers worked to schedule ammunition shipments, anticipate replacement barrels, and prepare contingency plans for guns that would fail under sustained use. Briefings also stressed discipline. The Stinger could mirror heroism and horror, and must be used with restraint when protection of civilians or prisoners was at stake. Senior officers reminded crews that improvisation carried responsibility. On the night before departure, chaplains and comrades walked among the ranks, listening to whispered letters folded into uniforms and fleeting jokes that tried to keep fear at bay. Engineers checked landing craft, welding joints and greasing winches. Cooks layered bread and powdered coffee into crates, rituals that preserved a sense of normalcy amid plans for destruction. As the convoys slipped into the Pacific and the silhouette of Iwo Jima appeared on the horizon, the hush among men deepened into a solemn readiness. Grevich, his hands stained with oil and sawdust from the makeshift shops where stingers had been born, took a final inventory of weapons and ammunition, feeling the weight of responsibility not only for his own life, but for the hundreds who would rely upon the suppressive wall his devices could create. They knew the island would test every innovation, every seam of training and courage. They also knew the calculus of sacrifice that had driven them to improvise would soon be measured in lives saved and lost on volcanic sand. They braced for dawn. The landing on Iwo Jima on February 19th detonated everything the 5th Marine Division had rehearsed and everything the island's defenders had prepared. The beachhead became a crucible where improvisation, training, and sheer will collided in black volcanic ash. From the moment the first Amtraks churned toward shore, the terrain betrayed the attackers. Ash that swallowed boots, vehicles bogged in drifting terraces, and a silence that felt like a held breath until, at Kuribayashi's chosen moment, it shattered into pre-registered artillery and interlocking machine gun fury. The stingers, carried by men who had once been parachute candidates and toolmakers, found their baptism in that maelstrom. Tony Stein moved forward with his weapon strapped across his chest, the contraption's welded seams and retrofitted stock a testament to field ingenuity. When he stood and deliberately drew fire, he converted Japanese doctrine into vulnerability, turning carefully concealed firing ports into beacons of position as muzzle flashes lit berms and concrete. The Stinger's torrent of lead did what heavier, slower firing systems could not. It crowded the air with such density that defenders found no seam to exploit, suppressed firing ports with concentrated bursts, and permitted demolition teams to scramble across open ground and close on pillboxes. Each short burst of 70 rounds was a tactical incision that created seconds that in island fighting were the currency of survival. Logistics strained under the demand. Ammunition runners sprinted back and forth across hellish stretches of ash, making repeated trips to feed a weapon that burned through belts in seconds. Stein made those runs again and again, each dash a gamble with artillery and rifle fire. Each return he carried a wounded comrade or another 100-round box. The Stinger's limitations were stark. Barrels overheated rapidly without the slipstream cooling they had been designed to enjoy, and accuracy over distance suffered once heat built and recoil accumulated. Yet those drawbacks were managed by doctrine: short disciplined bursts, immediate displacement, pairing gunners with resupply runners, innovations born in workshop conversations and hardened under fire. Commanders watching from the beach and flotillas saw outcomes and adjusted tactics on the fly, sending more demolition teams where Stinger suppression had created gaps, orchestrating short coordinated assaults rather than long, predictable advances. The psychological effect cannot be overstated. Japanese troops, trained to respect the rhythm of Browning fire, found themselves under a new storm, a sound and density of lead that shattered preconceptions and induced hesitation. Those pauses allowed Marines to exploit terrain, gain footholds behind collapsed pillboxes, and carry forward casualty evacuation when possible. The cost remained terrible. Casualties mounted in the hundreds as Kuribayashi's doctrine, wait, concentrate fire, interlock fields, inflicted appalling losses in the first hours. Yet for units equipped with Stingers, the calculus shifted. Positions that would have held a platoon at bay for hours could be silenced long enough for engineers to place charges or for flamethrower teams to close. As night fell, the island still burned, and the ash still held the dead and the dying. But the fragile American lodgment had been carved out of terror and tenacity. Leaders on both sides reevaluated assumptions. Japanese commanders saw an enemy weapon that altered the geometry of suppression. American officers realized that bottom-up innovation could yield asymmetric tactical payoffs. In forward aid stations, corpsmen worked with methodical urgency to stabilize and evacuate wounded. Medics learned to expect burns, shrapnel, and shock from weapons that tore at the body in unfamiliar patterns. The first day did not decide Iwo Jima, but it crystallized the role of improvisation on the modern battlefield. The Stinger was not a panacea. Its barrels would fail, its boxes would empty, and the island would not fall in a week. But for the men pinned behind hills and terraces, it was a difference between being slaughtered in place and having a chance to advance. By nightfall, survivors on both sides understood that new kinds of courage had been introduced to an ancient calculus of fire and ground. Courage to create, courage to wield, and courage to carry others through the black ash to whatever hope remained. The brutal arithmetic of Iwo Jima reduced strategy to small unit choices, where sergeants and corporals shaped outcomes with split-second judgments. The battle became a mosaic of micro-decisions in which tools like the Stinger turned individual initiative into operational advantage. Platoon leaders learned fast that terrain dictated options. The loose ash made entrenchments unreliable, tunnel mouths hid lethal fields of fire, and the volcanic terraces produced sight lines that favored defenders who refused to be lured into predictable patterns. In that context, the Stinger rewired tactical thinking. Rather than waiting for concentrated machine gun sections to reposition, squad commanders embedded a Stinger with the assault element, planning assaults around its suppressive wall and rehearsing synchronized rushes where infantry would close the gap during the gun's bursts. This required trust. The gunner had to expose himself to locate hidden firing ports, yet needed the squad to exploit each suppression window instantly. That trust was fragile, earned through training and the shared risk of mud and ash. Ammunition discipline became doctrine. Fire control officers marked pre-planned bursts and choreographed the timing so that resupply runners could be staged at pre-arranged intervals. When radios failed amid smoke and deafening naval guns, warriors reverted to simpler signals: hand flares, shouted commands, and coded whistle blasts. Those improvised communications threaded together assaults where chaos might otherwise prevail. Engineers and demolition teams adapted too. Instead of slow, methodical approaches under covering fire, they learned to time their rushes to the Stinger's cadence, sliding into dead zones while the weapon suppressed adjacent arcs. The symbiosis between gunner and assault team produced a new choreography of violence: a short tearing burst, an explosive sprint, a satchel charge, collapse of the pillbox. In numerous instances, this pattern unlatched positions that had repelled larger forces. Small units also had to manage morale and fatigue under crushing attrition. Men who had trained together and improvised solutions in Hawaii now watched friends killed and wounded. Leadership depended less on rank than on presence and deliberate calm. The paramarine ethos permeated these pockets: a bias for action, willingness to accept risk, and a refusal to let doctrine hinder the solution. Officers who had once sneered at unauthorized weapons now measured their utility in lives saved and ground taken. But such utility bred controversy. Some commanders feared that unregulated innovations undermined cohesion and safety, while others argued that rigid adherence to procurement and doctrine had already cost lives that improvisation might have spared. Debate simmered, often unresolved, because the island would not pause for administrative consensus. The Japanese adapted as well, shifting search patterns for ammunition runners, creating decoy firing ports and exploiting the periods when Stingers cooled to counterattack. Night raids aimed to capture a gun or its crew, knowing that removing one Stinger could open a hole in an assault line. Patrols and countermeasures made the logistics of reloading and repair deadly tasks performed under fire. In that grinding environment, personal leadership mattered. Junior leaders who modeled calm under concussion and who facilitated ammunition runs kept positions viable. Those who panicked saw units unravel. The interplay between innovation and leadership was the hidden grammar of the fighting. By the end of the first week, dozens of small unit engagements demonstrated a pattern. Where Stingers were employed intelligently and supported by disciplined supply, American units gained measurable tactical advantage. Where the guns were used recklessly or without logistics, they rapidly became liabilities. These battlefield lessons circulated up the chain as officers wrote immediate tactical reports, recommending procedural changes for subsequent assaults. The momentum the Stinger created in small unit actions fed larger operations, enabling companies to punch holes through complex defenses that would otherwise require prohibitive artillery or tank support. In a campaign where every yard exacted blood, those punctures mattered. They allowed follow-on forces to push flanks and to probe tunnel networks where engineers could place charges. The island's subterranean character meant gains were often temporary and bloody, but the accumulation of tactical successes slowly eroded Japanese capacity to mass defensive fires. The price paid for these punctures was human and steep. Each gain carried a ledger of wounded and dead, whose names populated aid stations and ship manifests. Yet the calculus war demanded, measured in holding ground for B-29 emergency fields and escort basing, placed moral gravity on choices made in smoky corridors, trenches of ash and rubble-strewn approaches. The story of small unit decisions on Iwo Jima thus became a testament to adaptive leadership under fire, where initiative met logistics, where improvisation met discipline, and where courage met craft. The Stinger was not a miracle weapon. It was a catalyst that amplified the outcomes of those who wielded it with skill, restraint, and a profound sense of responsibility for the men alongside them. Innovation in war brings both benefit and burden. The Stinger's tactical successes were undeniable, but so were the ethical, logistical, and institutional costs that shadowed its use. On Iwo Jima, the gun's very effectiveness created dilemmas that commanders and supply officers had to confront hourly. Ammunition consumption skyrocketed, straining ship-to-shore logistics already taxed by casualty evacuation, vehicle recovery, and fuel demands. Ammunition convoys became vulnerable targets. Landing craft that carried boxes of belted 30-06 to forward positions did so under enemy artillery and the risk of bogging in ash. Supply officers improvised palletized dumps and prioritized Stinger resupply in certain sectors. But prioritization itself bred tension. Choosing where to feed a gun meant choosing which line would hold and which might fail. At the human level, the Stinger's appetite for rounds forced gunners into repeated exposure. The heroic runs Tony Stein made to retrieve belts illustrated both tactical necessity and the moral reckoning of using a weapon that required men to risk themselves to sustain its effect. The barrel's vulnerability to overheating required strict training and discipline. Careless firing turned a potent weapon into a ruined tool at the worst moment. Commanders instituted rigid fire cycles, paired gunners with relief teams, and cached spare barrels where possible, yet in the fog of battle adherence, sometimes frayed. Field repairs, jury-rigged by toolmakers and ordnance men, extended lifespans but demanded skills and time that were luxuries on a screaming beach. Beyond logistics, ethical questions surfaced about non-standard weapons. The Stingers were unofficial, existing in a grey institutional area that protected inventors like Grevich from formal censure, while exposing them to post-war erasure. After heavy fighting, Army and Marine procurement experts debated whether to formalize such innovations. Some argued that Stinger lessons ought to be integrated into doctrine and procurement. Others warned that weapons created outside rigorous testing could introduce unforeseen risks to troops and civilians. Political and bureaucratic inertia won out. The immediate post-war period favored standardization and demobilization, and the 6 Stingers, symbols of battlefield creativity, disappeared into cleanup and disposal. The institutional forgetting was itself a cost. Lessons learned in the crucible of necessity, risk being lost when the pressure of war eased. Ethically, some questioned whether weapons with such concentrated suppression encouraged tactics that increased close-quarters slaughter in tunnels and bunkers where both combatants and non-combatants could be caught. These debates were rarely aired on the beach amid immediate survival. They emerged later in staff rooms and study groups analyzing after-action reports. The psychological cost touched combatants intimately. Gunners who had seen how rapidly a Stinger's fusillade could shred mortal bodies carried images that haunted them. Some veterans recounted nightmares of the tearing roar. Others described a sober pride that their makeshift work saved comrades' lives. Historians wrestling with the legacy of improvised weapons must weigh such human testimony alongside tactical data and procurement logic. In the longer term, however, the Stinger's influence echoed through weapons development. The post-war US military pursued lighter, more portable automatic weapons that balanced rate of fire with barrel change systems and sustainable logistics. The M60, And eventually squad automatic weapons like the M249 embodied these trade-offs, seeking to capture the Stinger's mobility without its overheating pathology. The story of the Stinger also shaped institutional memory about innovation. Commanders learned that empowering junior leaders to improvise could yield disproportionate tactical gains, but that such empowerment required parallel systems of accountability and after-action capture to make innovation durable. On the island itself, the cost was paid in blood. The Stinger helped clear fields of fire and saved lives, but it did not obviate the slaughter that Kuribayashi's doctrine exacted. Each tactical gain was matched by scars on bodies and psyches. Yet amid the ash and smoke, some truths endured. Necessity pushes invention. The front line often births solutions far faster than headquarters, and human courage remains the axis upon which technical advantage turns into operational success. The Stinger's legacy, therefore, is paradoxical. It is at once a story of creative adaptation that saved lives and a cautionary tale about the institutional fragility that can erase such innovations once the emergency abates. The granular human record of Iwo Jima preserves the Stinger's impact through letters, after-action statements, and oral histories that capture a textured picture of how improvisation altered combat life on the island. Marines who served with improvised weapons recalled a mixture of practical gratitude and private discomfort. Some veterans wrote home with blunt accounts. "It stopped their heads up for a second," one corporal reported, describing the way a Stinger's burst allowed a demolition man to crawl to a pillbox. Another drafted a letter that never left his pocket, a short line about a friend who did not come back from a resupply run. These fragments show how tactical utility and personal cost were braided together. Medical officers and corpsmen left testimonies that illuminate secondary effects. The nature of wounds under high-volume suppressive fire differed from typical small-arms engagements, producing dense perforation patterns and complex trauma that tested surgical triage afloat and on shore. Surgeons improvised techniques for extraction and wound control, learning in the thick of combat to prioritize certain interventions based on ammunition-limited evacuation timelines. On the Japanese side, captured diaries and post-war interrogations reveal how defenders perceived the Stinger as a novel menace. Accounts describe a disorientation at the sound and volume of fire that disrupted their timing and forced shifts in firing patterns. Kuribayashi's officers adjusted by dispersing defense and increasing night patrols, yet the psychological effect lingered. Surprise and brief paralysis had tactical consequences, even when material damage was limited. Oral histories also exposed debates within Marine ranks about recognition and responsibility. Grevich recounted his work without flourish, insisting that the Stinger was just something that had to be done. Others in command quietly endorsed him with written notes that protected him from formal reprimand, but also allowed the Corps to distance itself later. Tony Stein's widow and mother later argued over burial rites, a painful human subplot to glory and grief. Stein's Medal of Honor citation explicitly referenced his improvised weapon, an unusual bureaucratic acknowledgement of an unsanctioned tool that underlines the ambiguity of wartime necessity. Historians piecing these voices together find recurring themes. Improvisation breeds moral complexity. Battlefield success does not guarantee institutional adoption, and memory is shaped as much by what was erased as by what was recorded. The Stinger's story persisted in reunions and veteran recollections, kept alive by those who had carried it, and by communities that refused to let field expedients vanish into dusty storerooms. Museums and firearms historians later reconstructed replicas, examined components, and debated whether official channels should have preserved or adapted the design. These debates were not merely technical. They were arguments about how institutions value frontline ingenuity, and whether the messy, hands-on solutions of combat can or should be folded cleanly into doctrine. On Iwo Jima itself, the ash absorbed many names and stories that never returned to public pages, ordinary acts of bravery that weaponized improvisation and ordinary folkship into survival. The Stinger becomes, in these voices, both a literal tool and a symbol of what soldiers do when doctrine fails, of how moral calculus shifts under fire, and of a cultural moment in the Corps when practical problem-solving was a survival skill. Collectively, these testimonies refuse simplistic heroism or sanitized invention. They render the Stinger as a human artifact, effective, flawed, morally complicated, and indispensable to certain men in certain hours. When the guns finally fell silent, and the island remained scorched and littered with the dead, Iwo Jima entered the slow, contested work of memory and meaning-making. The Stinger's physical existence vanished, likely destroyed as non-standard ordnance during cleanup and demobilization. February 19, 1945. The black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima boiled beneath the weight of history. The air itself seemed alive with fire as the Pacific roared under a sky split by the thunder of naval bombardments. Waves of U.S. Marines crawled forward, each step sinking into ash, each heartbeat echoing against the island's obsidian slopes. Mount Suribachi loomed above them like a silent god of war, its face scarred by artillery and smoke. The Japanese defenders had turned this patch of rock into a fortress, a labyrinth of tunnels, gun nests and hidden artillery built to slaughter anything that moved. When the first Marines landed, they were swallowed by hell. Machine gun traces stitched across the sand, mortars tore men apart, and the air turned into a burning fog of cordite and screams. The 5th Marine Division was among the first to feel the true scale of this nightmare. Among them was a group of ordinary men who carried extraordinary determination, and one sergeant whose mind would later spark a legend. His name would be whispered with both admiration and disbelief: Sergeant Milan Grevich. Iwo Jima was unlike any battlefield the Marines had seen. Flamethrower teams advanced under curtains of smoke, tanks bogged down in soft volcanic ash, and air support struggled to distinguish friend from foe. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood. It wasn't just an invasion, it was an exorcism of the Pacific War's darkest fury. The Japanese were determined to die where they stood. They used intricate bunkers and machine gun emplacements that survived even direct hits from naval shells. Against such defenses, conventional tactics often failed. Firepower was life, but on Iwo Jima, even firepower had its limits. The Marines' standard M1919 machine guns, reliable but slow, were being pushed to their breaking point. The brutal conditions, endless engagements, and fanatical Japanese resistance demanded weapons that could unleash devastation faster than ever before. Amid the chaos, Sergeant Grevich and his men found themselves facing an impossible dilemma: how to survive against an enemy who refused to stop shooting. As the days stretched into nights filled with the orange glow of tracer fire, the sergeant began to see a pattern. Moments when their guns jammed or overheated cost lives. Moments when the Japanese outgunned them by sheer persistence. Something had to change. In that crucible of volcanic ash and blood, the seed of an idea took root. An idea that broke the rules of military engineering and battlefield convention alike. It was born not in laboratories or factories, but in foxholes and makeshift bunkers, under fire so fierce it melted steel and seared memory. That idea would soon transform an ordinary aircraft weapon into a ground-based monster, one that spat bullets 3 times faster than any marine gun on the island. And it would make Sergeant Grevich a legend among men who rarely lived long enough to see legends made. Iwo Jima would be remembered for its flag-raising, for its unyielding brutality, but hidden within its firestorm was another story, a quieter revolution of steel and ingenuity, of men who refused to fight by the book when the book could no longer save them. The stage was set, the island burned, and one sergeant's forbidden experiment was about to change the rhythm of death itself. The Marines had fought through hell before, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, but Iwo Jima was different. It wasn't just the enemy that was relentless, it was the very land itself. The black sand swallowed boots, equipment, and morale, every foxhole filled with ash. The smell of sulfur and burning flesh hung in the air, a grim perfume of death that refused to fade. Marines fought for every crater, every ridge, every breath. The Japanese, buried deep within miles of interconnected tunnels, could vanish after an ambush, only to reappear hours later behind American lines. In such chaos, every weapon mattered, and for Sergeant Milan Grevich's unit, one weapon in particular was failing them when they needed it most: the Browning M1919A4 machine gun. Designed for reliability, the M1919 was the backbone of Marine fire support. But on Iwo Jima, it faced a problem no designer had anticipated: the island's volcanic grit. The fine black particles infiltrated the gun's mechanism, grinding between the moving parts and jamming the action. Marines would tear the weapon apart under fire, desperate to clear stoppages while bullets snapped overhead. Every second lost meant lives lost. Grevich knew it too well. He had seen men die waiting for their guns to cycle, seen Japanese troops charge through smoke, while machine gunners cursed their jammed weapons. The M1919 could fire 400 to 500 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, but Iwo Jima was anything but ideal. Sometimes the guns slowed to half that rate. The sergeant began to study every malfunction, every hesitation in the weapon's rhythm. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't supposed to tinker with government-issued firearms. But desperation had no regulations. He noticed something crucial. The rate of fire dropped because of mechanical drag in the recoil system, exacerbated by dirt, carbon, and friction. It wasn't a design flaw. It was a battlefield flaw, and he believed he could fix it. Grevich's men laughed at first when he spoke of making the guns faster. Faster meant hotter barrels, more jams, and burned-out parts. It was suicide, they thought. But Grevich wasn't after theoretical perfection. He wanted battlefield survival. The Japanese weren't slowing down, and neither could they. He spent nights hunched over his machine gun in the flickering light of a half-buried lamp, surrounded by the smell of oil, gunpowder, and desperation. He stripped and rebuilt the Browning with the patience of a craftsman and the recklessness of a man with nothing left to lose. Using scavenged parts from damaged guns, he began experimenting with spring tension, buffer weights, and the recoil booster, a small device at the muzzle that helped cycle the gun's action. Then he had his moment of revelation. If the gas pressure could be redirected and intensified just slightly, the gun's bolt would cycle faster, much faster. The standard design was conservative, engineered for longevity. But Grevich wasn't fighting for longevity. He was fighting for seconds. Seconds meant life. The modification was dangerous, unauthorized, and entirely illegal under Marine Corps regulations. But the battlefield didn't care about regulations. When he finally tested it, the gun roared with a fury none of them had ever heard before. The muzzle climbed, brass sprayed like rain, and the weapon screamed at nearly triple its normal rate of fire. It was beautiful and terrifying. In that moment, Grevich knew he had broken the rules and built something that might just change the balance of power on that cursed island. What began as a field repair had become a mechanical rebellion. The sergeant had created a weapon that defied the manual, the regulations, and perhaps even common sense. But soon, under the unrelenting fury of Iwo Jima, it would prove itself worthy of the battlefield. When necessity outpaced doctrine, improvisation became a weapon. Milan Grevich's work on the Browning and his encounter with salvaged aircraft guns were not isolated acts of tinkering. They were the opening chord of a furious composition that would crescendo on Iwo Jima. Chapter 3 follows the slow, stubborn alchemy by which disparate parts, aircraft guns, rifle stocks, bar bipods, crude triggers, were welded into a single lethal instrument. It is a story of metal and muscle, of men trained to follow orders, who learned instead to ask how to survive them. The transformation began in the gritty backrooms of forward maintenance sheds and the shadowed workshops of island airfields where damaged planes were stripped for parts. Aircraft machine guns, AM2 Browning 30 caliber types, were plentiful on the beaches and in wrecked fuselages. Designed for high-speed aerial engagements, they were light, compact, and built to trade longevity for instantaneous volume of fire. In flight, the thin barrels and reduced receiver mass were advantages. On the ground, they were liabilities. Still, their cyclic rates, up to 200 rounds per minute, offered a promise Marines could not ignore. The question was how to make that promise useful in infantry fighting. Grevich and John Little approached the problem as machinists and Marines. Their goal was not to invent from scratch, but to adapt quickly. They scavenged M1 Garand stocks for a solid shoulder piece that would give a man aiming stability and leverage. From the Browning automatic rifle, they cannibalized bipods and sights familiar to every Marine already trained on the bar's handling. The challenge lay in marrying components never designed to mate: the AM2's strange buffer tube, the Garand's wooden geometry, the bar's mount points. Each fit required careful cutting, filing, and improvised brackets welded in the dim light of field workshops. Precision was a luxury. Function was not. The electrical solenoid triggers of the aircraft guns presented a separate hurdle. Aircraft mounts could use the airframe's power systems to pulse solenoids. Infantry gunners could not. Grevich fashioned a mechanical linkage from sheet metal, a simple finger-operated trigger that translated human touch into reliable firing without electricity. Iteration followed iteration. Early prototypes either failed under recoil or discharged accidentally. Grevich learned to balance spring tension against trigger travel, to shape the linkage so it would not jam with dirt, ash, or sweat. When the mechanism finally provided a crisp, repeatable pull, the weapon could be aimed like any rifle, controlled like any machine gun. Barrel heat was the Achilles heel. Without aircraft slipstream, the thin AM2 barrels baked within seconds of sustained fire. Warping and melting were real risks, but its imprint endured across doctrine, veteran testimony, and the subtle evolution of infantry weapons. In the immediate post-war period, the U.S. military prioritized standardization, peacetime safety, and logistical rationalization. Improvisations born of exigency were inconvenient anomalies to be archived rather than institutionalized. Yet the practical lessons persisted in other ways. Procurement officers who had read urgent reports of Stinger effectiveness argued for lighter general-purpose machine guns, for barrel change systems, and for doctrinal allowances for rapid frontline innovation under controlled review. The M60 and later squad automatic weapons reflect an institutional move toward portable, supportable automatic fire, an indirect echo of what Grevich and his comrades had improvised on Ash and Blood. Veteran reunions kept the Stinger's memory alive. Men who had carried or been covered by its fire shared stories in quiet rooms, trading technical detail and moral reflection with friends who understood both the utility and the cost. Museums commissioned replicas. Firearms historians reverse-engineered mechanisms. Television programs and documentaries revisited the narrative, framing it within larger conversations about ingenuity in wartime. Meanwhile, families of those who fought, like Tony Stein's widow and mother, grappled publicly with valor and loss, underscoring how personal grief and public honor intersect in war's aftermath. Ethical debates about improvisation and unauthorized weapons continued in staff colleges and journals. Scholars asked whether the speed of battlefield invention could be reconciled with institutional safety. Policymakers wrestled with frameworks that might permit creative solutions while preserving accountability and supply chain integrity. In the end, the Stinger's most enduring lesson may be cultural rather than technical. Militaries that encourage responsible initiative at junior levels and that capture those innovations rapidly for analysis and potential formal adoption gain adaptability without losing discipline. The Stinger story also serves as a reminder that technological advantage is not merely the province of factories and research labs. Sometimes it arrives out of hand tools, hot metal, and the moral courage to act when doctrine lags behind the danger at hand. Iwo Jima's volcanic ash preserved the cost of those choices, but memory preserved their meaning. A small set of improvised guns helped save lives and secured ground at a staggering price. The island remains a testament to sacrifice and to the paradox of innovation in war. That necessity can create brilliance, that brilliance can carry a burden, and that both are inseparable from the human stories of those who built, fired, and lived with their consequences.